Some inheritances come with a note, a key, a folder of paperwork explaining exactly what you're getting. This one came with none of that. Just a phone call, a dusty deed, and a silence that would take 6 months to break. This is the story of Daniel Hargrove and the ranch his grandfather left behind. Daniel Hargrove was 34 years old, sandy blonde hair going thin at the temples, pale blue eyes, the kind of build that came from sitting behind a desk for 12 years doing tax audits in Columbus, Ohio. He wasn't a rancher. He wasn't an outdoorsman. He had never so much as pitched a tent. So when the lawyer called on a gray Tuesday afternoon in October and told him that his grandfather, Walter Hargrove, had passed away in Wyoming and left him a 40-acre cattle ranch, Daniel assumed it was a mistake. "There's no mistake," the lawyer said. "Your grandfather named you specifically. You're the sole beneficiary." Daniel hadn't seen Walter Hargrove in almost 20 years. What he remembered of the man was fragmented. A tall figure in a canvas coat, silver gray hair cropped close, a face weathered like cracked leather, and eyes so pale blue they almost looked white in certain light. Walter had been the kind of man who spoke maybe 10 words a day and meant every one of them. After Daniel's grandmother died when Daniel was 12, Walter had pulled away from the family entirely. No calls, no letters, just silence, stretching across 2 decades, until this. Daniel's wife, Sarah, a freckled woman with wavy brown hair and green eyes who taught 3rd grade back in Columbus, was the one who convinced him to go out and see the place before deciding whether to sell it. "You inherited land, Daniel," she told him over dinner. "You at least owe it a look." So in November, Daniel flew out to Casper, rented a truck, and drove 90 minutes northwest into a stretch of high plains country where the wind never seemed to stop and the horizon went on forever. The Hargrove Ranch sat at the end of a rutted dirt road, 40 acres of dry grassland ringed by a sagging barbed wire fence. The main house was a squat, single-story farmhouse with peeling white paint and a porch that leaned slightly to the left. Behind it stood a barn that had clearly not held livestock in years, its wood gone silver with age. There was no cattle, no equipment running, just wind, grass, and silence. Daniel stood in the yard for a long time before he worked up the nerve to go inside. The house smelled like dust and old wood smoke. Sheets were draped over some of the furniture. Newspapers from 1996 sat in a stack by the fireplace, curling at the edges. It looked, Daniel thought, like a man had simply stopped living there one day. Not died there, but stopped, mid-motion, and walked away. He found no basement door on his first walkthrough. It wasn't until his 3rd day at the property, when he was clearing out a hall closet stuffed with old coats and boots, that he noticed the closet's back wall didn't quite match the rest of the house. It was newer lumber, painted over to blend in, but newer all the same. Behind it was a narrow staircase leading down into total darkness. Daniel didn't go down that day. He told himself it was because his flashlight batteries were low. The truth was that something about the cold air rising up out of that stairwell made the hair stand up on his arms, and he wasn't ready for whatever was waiting at the bottom. He flew back to Ohio 3 days later, having made no decision about the property at all. For the next several months, Daniel couldn't stop thinking about that staircase. He told Sarah about it. He told his coworkers about it, in the vague, half-joking way people talk about things that actually unsettle them. He looked up the property records, the county archives, anything that might explain what his grandfather had built beneath that house, and why he'd hidden the entrance behind a false wall. He found almost nothing. Walter Hargrove had bought the ranch in 1961. He'd run cattle on it for over 30 years, quietly and unremarkably, according to the handful of old neighbors Daniel managed to track down by phone. Nobody mentioned a basement. Nobody mentioned any construction. One elderly rancher named Frank Dutton, a stooped, silver-haired man who'd lived 2 properties over from Walter for 40 years, told Daniel that Walter had grown strange sometime in the late 1980s, stopped coming into town as often, stopped talking to anybody at all by the time the 90s rolled around. "Man kept to himself," Dutton said, "real quiet, but there for a stretch there, he was buying up an awful lot of concrete and rebar for a fella who wasn't building anything anybody could see." That detail stuck with Daniel for weeks. In April, almost 6 months after that first trip, Daniel flew back out to Wyoming. this time with Sarah, a proper set of tools, a generator, and enough flashlights and lanterns to light up a football field. He wasn't going to let that staircase sit unexplored any longer. The false wall came down easily once Daniel got a crowbar behind it. Cold, mineral-smelling air rushed up out of the dark, and the beam of his flashlight caught a set of wooden stairs, descending maybe 15 feet into the earth. Sarah stood at the top, arms crossed, clearly unconvinced this was a good idea. "If you're not back up in 10 minutes, I'm calling someone," she said. Daniel went down alone. The staircase led out into a space far larger than he'd expected, a poured concrete room roughly the size of the farmhouse above it, maybe 30 feet by 40 feet, with a low ceiling reinforced by steel support beams. The construction was crude but sturdy, clearly built by hand over a long period of time, not by any commercial contractor. What filled the room stopped Daniel cold. Shelving lined every wall, floor to ceiling, packed with hundreds of glass jars and metal tins, each one labeled in Walter's cramped, careful handwriting. Seeds, dried grains, what looked like preserved meat and vegetables, decades old. Beyond the shelves stood stacks of canvas-wrapped bundles, crates of ammunition, coils of rope, hand tools, water drums lined up in neat rows against the far wall. And in the center of the room, under a heavy canvas tarp, sat something large and rectangular that Daniel could not identify by flashlight alone. He pulled the tarp back. Underneath was a wooden cabinet, hand-built, its surface covered in carved markings. Not decorative, but methodical, almost like a ledger, carved directly into the wood. Rows and rows of tally marks, dates, short phrases too worn and shadowed to read clearly in the dim light. Inside the cabinet were dozens of leather-bound notebooks, their pages filled edge to edge with the same cramped handwriting Daniel had seen on the jar labels. He carried 3 of the notebooks up into daylight and sat with Sarah on the porch steps, paging through them in stunned silence. The notebooks were journals, not the rambling kind, meticulous, dated, almost scientific in their structure. Entries about rainfall, entries about soil composition, entries about food preservation techniques, water purification, structural reinforcement calculations for the room below the house. But mixed in among the practical notes were other entries. Shorter, stranger, more personal. Walter writing about dreams he'd had. Walter writing about a sound he heard some nights, coming from somewhere out on the eastern edge of the property, that he could never quite place. Walter writing, again and again across different years, about preparing for something he called only the long winter. Never explained in detail, never dated to any specific expectation, just referenced as an inevitability he was quietly building toward, year after year, alone. The last entry was dated barely 2 weeks before Walter died. It read, in full, "Storeroom finished. 40 years of work, and I don't know that I'll ever need a single jar of it. But it's done. Whoever finds this, take what you need, and don't be afraid of what's down here. It was never about fear. It was about being ready. That's all a man can do." Daniel sat with that for a long time. Word travels fast in small communities, even quiet ones. Within a month of Daniel's discovery, a local historian named Dr. Eleanor Combs, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a tight bun and wire-rimmed glasses, reached out after hearing about the find through a mutual contact at the county archive. She specialized in 20th century rural homestead life, and she asked permission to document the room before anything was disturbed further. She brought with her a colleague, Professor Richard Voss, a structural engineer from the State University, tall and broad-shouldered, with close-cropped gray hair and a calm, methodical way of speaking. Voss spent an entire day just examining the room's construction. The poured concrete, the steel reinforcement, the ventilation system Walter had rigged using nothing but scavenged ductwork and a hand-cranked fan. This wasn't built in a weekend, Voss told Daniel, running a hand along one of the support beams. This is decades of incremental work by someone with no formal engineering training. And frankly, it's better built than a lot of permitted structures I've inspected. The ventilation alone would have taken serious trial and error to get right. Dr. Combs, meanwhile, was captivated by the journals. She spent 3 full days in the farmhouse, photographing pages, cross-referencing dates against known regional events, droughts, cold winters, economic downturns in the ranching industry throughout the 70s and 80s. What's remarkable, she told Daniel and Sarah one evening over coffee at the kitchen table, is that this wasn't a reaction to any single crisis. He didn't build this because of one bad winter or one bad year of prices. The pattern in these journals shows steady, continuous work, stretching back to at least 1979, maybe earlier. Something set him on this path a long time before anyone around here noticed anything was different. She held up one of the earliest notebooks, its leather cover cracked with age. Whatever your grandfather was preparing for, she said, he believed in it enough to spend half his life on it, quietly, without ever telling a soul. Not everything added up cleanly, and both experts were honest about that. The eastern edge of the property, the same area Walter referenced in his journals, the source of the sound he could never place, turned out to have something out there after all. A low, man-made mound of earth, roughly the size of a small shed, overgrown with grass, easy to miss, unless you knew to look for it. When Voss and a small crew carefully excavated part of it, they found a second, much smaller concrete chamber, empty except for a single steel box bolted to the floor. Inside the box, a sealed glass jar containing a folded sheet of paper, water-stained but legible. It was dated 1979, the earliest entry Walter had made in any of his journals by nearly 2 years. It read simply, "If you're reading this, it means I never got the chance to tell you myself. I don't expect anyone to understand. I'm not sure I understand it either. Just know I did what I thought was right, and I never stopped. No name." No further explanation. Dr. Combs called it one of the strangest primary source documents she'd encountered in her career. Not because of what it said, but because of what it didn't. There was no crisis it referenced, no fear it named, no ideology it belonged to. Just a decision, made once, and kept for the rest of a man's life. Voss, for his part, couldn't explain why Walter had built a second, isolated chamber at all, when the main storeroom already had ample space. Redundancy makes sense in survivalist planning, he admitted, but this level of compartmentalization, two separate hidden structures, decades apart, that's unusual. That suggests a level of caution most people in this line of thinking don't reach. Neither expert could offer Daniel a tidy answer for why. Only a clearer picture of how thoroughly, and for how long, his grandfather had committed to whatever private conviction had taken hold of him in 1979 and never let go. It had been 6 months to the day since Daniel first stood at the top of that hidden staircase, unwilling to go down. By the time the experts finished their work, the ranch had changed in Daniel's mind entirely. It was no longer a strange inheritance he intended to sell off quickly and forget. Sarah had taken an early leave from teaching to spend more time out there with him, cataloging journal entries, helping Dr. Combs prepare a modest exhibit on rural self-sufficiency culture for the Regional Historical Society. Daniel still didn't know exactly what his grandfather had been preparing for all those years. Maybe Walter hadn't fully known either. Maybe it was never about one specific danger, but about the discipline of readiness itself, practiced quietly for its own sake, year after year, in a house at the end of a dirt road where nobody was watching. Standing in the storeroom now, flashlight no longer necessary since Daniel had run proper electric lines down the staircase, he looked at the shelves of jars, the carved tally marks on the old wooden cabinet, the neat rows of dates stretching back further than his own memory of his grandfather went. "He was down here for 40 years, Daniel said to Sarah, and none of us ever knew. Sarah didn't have an answer for that, neither in the end did the experts. Some inheritances come with a note. This one came with a locked room, 40 years of silence, and a single sentence that Daniel Hargrove now keeps framed above his desk back in Ohio, torn carefully from the last page of his grandfather's final journal. It was never about fear, it was about being ready. That's all a man can do.